Today, I have a much more personal note um, than what I typically would talk about here on my Substack. And it really has to do with my family life, which is something I don't often discuss, but I feel like, there's a moment right now that it really does make sense to sort of, I guess, let out some of the things that have been on my mind over the last week or so. Uh, for some of you who may follow me on social media, you might have seen that my son graduated from high school, right? He's 17 years old and he's now, going on to that next phase and that next step of going to college and, that next march towards adulthood. And though that moment should have felt joyful or even cinematic, it felt like um very emotionally dense and a whirlwind to an extent, uh, as well as something that brought me a bit of anxiety prior to, but I was happy enough to see that things turned out well, at least on the surface. There was a lot of apologies, there was a lot of hugs, a lot of picture taking, a lot of pride, some level of grief and a revelation. I've been thinking about the way in which nostalgia, right, can trick us into rewriting our traumas as being simpler, sweeter stories than they really are. Nostalgia can seduce us, right? It can seduce us into clinging to memories while evading the full weight of what those memories really held. This graduation weekend for my son was very beautiful. My son is a young black man who moves through this world with a lot of disruptions, more than most adults. He walked across that stage with an honor roll sash, a scholarship, and the kind of humility that really comes from real life struggle. He sings in the chorus, he works at Publix, he's in the National Honor Society. Perhaps most importantly, he has made friends down here in South Carolina. He's found a way to root himself even when the ground beneath him has never stopped shifting. My son has attended, I want to say, 8 schools across 4 different cities from K through 12, and he never broke. He adjusted, he rose, but behind that, was a very deeply human and complicated weekend, a reminder that even when growth happens, healing isn't linear. My son's mother flew in town for the graduation, and suffice to say, I would say we have a long and somewhat difficult history, one that spans over 2 decades of competing truths, cycles of resentment, and quite a bit of disconnect, if we want to be honest, in the last decade or so. And my wife, who's been a very active mother figure in my son's life and the person who kind of organized and played conduit this entire weekend, I guess she's also continually found herself in an unfair position. There's times where her legitimacy in her role has been questioned, despite the fact that she shows up for my son daily. Placing these two women, both invested in my son, into the same orbit, for the first time, emotions were high, and I was unsure how that mix was going to work, especially when you add in my mother-in-law, my son's other grandmother, a bunch of other cousins and people who kind of got together. We have a full chorus of different memories, different egos, different intentions, people angling, trying to do right, but also trying to be seen and also trying to protect their own sense of what they believe to be the history. Um, what struck me the most was how differently we all remember the past. I got custody of my son when he was around 10 years old. It wasn't necessarily something that I knew was going to happen. It wasn't even something that I necessarily fought for. It was just circumstances sort of created the opportunity where it made sense for my son to be with me. And then once he was with me for a year, that's when I really fought hard for just making that year not be temporary and making it be more permanent. And that part of our family story carries very different interpretations depending on who you ask. During the graduation weekend, I saw my son's mother recount to friends that I've made here in South Carolina about, the rapper guy that she used to date, as if, who I was then up until now was just filler, you know, as much as she may have not intentionally done so. It was almost as if I didn't change, as if, I haven't sort of grown or become a professor or a husband or a father in a way that maybe she didn't know me to be prior to me getting custody. Um, but, in all honesty, I have to recognize that I did have a level of inconsistency early on in my son's life, but at the same time, he's always grown up around me and at many times in my care. Um, but here's the complicated truth. She's not the sum of her mistakes either. I have to sit with that. Um, this weekend was a reminder, or this past weekend rather, was a reminder that my son deserves to know that both of his parents are evolving human beings that can actually share space, even if we haven't shared a language for how to honor each other's growth. And for me, that's sort of the heartbreak of co-parenting from a distance. Sometimes it's not just about the distance or the geography, it's about the distance of memory, identity, the roles we perform even after they've been expired. For a long time, I carried a lot of shame around the idea that I had a child with someone that I really didn't know. And I certainly didn't know them to represent me. And at a time where I don't even know if I truly knew myself. I was 23, an up and coming rapper trying to make a name for myself, and stability wasn't necessarily in the rearview mirror yet. And so when you're operating more on chemistry than compatibility, or energy rather than infrastructure, you know, to think about what came out of that chaotic time period is actually a source of light and a source of clarity. So sitting in the stands at Colonial Life Arena and watching my son smile, searching for our faces in the crowd and us holding up signs for him, I felt this wave of emotion, not just for him, but the version of us that made it here, for the version of his mom who made it here, for the version of my wife who chose to step up without a manual and sometimes without applause. And I realized that nostalgia can sometimes make us lie. It can make us pretend that the past was easier than it was, or the people in it were simpler than they are now. But it can also help us to see how far we've come. And if we let it, nostalgia can be a window, not a destination. So while this graduation weekend for my son was not perfect, I will say it was necessary, and it provided the space for some fences to be mended. And maybe it was a reminder that healing isn't always clean, that growth doesn't always mean consensus. Sometimes it just means choosing not to run, choosing to be present, choosing to clap, choosing to smile, choosing to hug, even when your heart is heavy with memory. My son made it. We made it. And maybe in a roundabout way, that is what this weekend was truly about. Um, I was thinking about that. I just wanted to share it in hopes that maybe me ruminating about my experiences might help one of my subscribers. So that's it. Signing off. Dr. Evans, office hours. Peace.